What's up, friends? Dan Vega here, and today we are talking about mutations in GraphQL. So if you've been around this channel, you know I'm a huge fan of GraphQL, specifically Spring for GraphQL and GraphQL Java. But everything we've done up until now has been a lot of getting started with GraphQL. We've taken a look at simple operation types like queries, but we really haven't gotten into mutations or subscriptions or some of the new things in the newer releases of Spring for GraphQL. So I want to start to address some of those, starting today with mutations. So we're going to take a look at how you can bind named GraphQL arguments onto some complex parameter types in Spring. So if you want to use simple types like strings or ints or booleans, that's fine. But we can also go ahead and bind to complex input types. We can use things like lists. And so I'm going to show a few of those examples today. We're just going to jump right in and create a new project. So I'm here at start.spring.io. I'm going to create a new Java Maven project. I'm going to use the latest release of Spring Boot 3, which is 3.0.4. And I'm going to go ahead and fill in some metadata. So I'm going to say dev.danvega. And we are going to call this, let's just say, mutations. Right? And these all look good. We'll use Java 17, and we need a few dependencies. So I'm going to choose web as the transport layer. I'm going to choose Spring for GraphQL. I'm also going to use some JPA persistence here. So I'm going to choose, let's say, Spring Data JPA, and we'll need a database for that. So I'm going to choose H2. So with that, everything looks good. I'm going to go ahead and generate this project. It's going to download a zip for me. As always, I'm going to open up in my favorite IDE, which is IntelliJ Ultimate. You can feel free to open this up in whatever IDE or text editor you're most productive in. With that, let's go ahead and start coding. Okay, so I have my project open in IntelliJ IDEA. I'm going to go ahead and rename this. For whatever reason, I just like this to be named Application, so I'm going to start there and say, okay, we're just going to run this just to make sure this runs without error. Before we do anything else, I like to make sure that I'm not going to have any issues, and I don't, so we can go ahead and get started. So I'm going to start by creating a new package. We're going to call this model, and I'm going to model this application around just a simple book and review. So I want to go ahead and start by creating a new Java class. We're going to call this book. And this is going to be an entity. We're using Spring Data JPA. So there is going to be a little bit of setup here. If you're not familiar with Spring Data JPA, that's fine. We can kind of fast forward. You could jump to a specific point. I'll leave some links for the chapters in the description below if you don't want to go through this part and just jump right into the GraphQL bits. That's fine. Some people like to see the entire construction of this application, so I'm going to stick with that. So I'm going to have a book. This is going to be pretty simple. We are just going to create a few fields here. I'm going to create an integer ID. This is going to be an ID and a generated value. I'm also going to have a string for title. I'm going to have an integer for pages. And then we are going to have a list of reviews. So let's say private list of reviews. We'll call this reviews. And we'll come back to this in a second. Let's go ahead and create a class called reviews in my model package. All right, this is going to be an entity. This is also going to need an ID. So we'll go ahead and say private integer ID. This is an ID with a generated value as well. We are also going to say that this is going to have a title. So, hey, this book was awesome. And then we'll have a comment. And then we will leave it at that for now. So let's go ahead and say we need a public no-arg constructor for JPA. We also need our own constructor that will take in a title and a comment. And then we'll need some getters and setters here. So we'll create those. And finally, I will go ahead and create a toString. So that's it for review. We come back to our book entity, and we need the same thing for this. We need a noarg constructor, so we'll create that. and then we'll need a constructor to create a new, you know what I forgot? I want to have author in here. So let's do private string author. And now we can go ahead and create our constructor that takes in those. So we'll say okay. And then I'm going to create some getters and setters for everything here. And finally, we'll have a toString for this. And that looks good. Okay. So now we just need to create a relationship between our book and our reviews. I'm going to create a one direction mapping. I don't need a bidirectional mapping here for this simple example. So I'm just going to say one to many, and we'll say that we are going to cascade this down. We'll say cascade type all, and that's all we need there. And I just need a join column. So I'll say join column. Name equals book ID. Yeah, that looks pretty good. So with that in place, I should have everything I need from a model perspective. Now what I'll need is I'll need a repository. So let me create a new Java class. We will call this the book repository. This will be an interface. And let me put this in the repository package. Okay, so we have an interface that extends the JPA repository. This is going to be for book, and this is a ID type of integer. Okay, so everything we need for the book repository is there. All right, I'm going to go ahead and go into Application.properties and set up a few things. We're going to say that we want to enable the H2 console. I want to generate a unique name false. I also want to set a data source name equal to books. We'll also show some SQL. So we'll say true, and that looks good for that. So with that, I need some sample data. So let's go ahead and just create a record really quick. Let's go into application, and I'm going to close this to give me a little bit more room. And let's just pull that down. So we're going to create a bean of command line runner, and this is going to, what do we want to do here? Yes, that looks right. I also want to bring in that book repository so that we can go ahead and save a book repository. So let's go ahead and create a new book. So we're going to say book. We'll call this Reactive Spring, and this is a new book. This isn't a new book, but this is a new book for us. But this is by my friend and coworker Josh Long, Reactive Spring, which is 484 pages long. I'm going to create a new review. So we'll say new review. Great book. I really enjoyed this book. I like that. So what we want to do on the reactive, what is that? Reactive Spring side is set a reviews. We'll just say list.of review, and we have a review now. And what will happen is this will get cascaded down when we save the book. So I'm going to say book repository.save reactive spring, and let's see if we have everything we need. Let's go ahead and rerun the application and see if we can do it without error. So far, so good. Select insert into book, insert into review, update review, so it sets the book ID. Everything looks right, but let's just go back to the browser and take a look at the H2 console. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and connect, and we'll select star from books, and there we have our book. And if we look at review, we have our review with our key, our reference back to our book. So everything looks good so far. This is what we wanted to see. Now what we want to do is kind of introduce the controller side of things, right? So let's go ahead and create a new controller. We will call this, we'll put this in a package called controller, and we'll call this the book controller. So in the book controller, this is going to be a REST controller. This is also going to have a request mapping of /API/books. we are going to need an instance of that book repository. So we will say private final book repository, and we will get this through constructor injection. And with that in place, we can now create a method here to return a list of books. We can call this, let's just call this all books for now. And yes, that is going to return the, did I not bring in the right book? Let's say import class, not that one, that one. Cool. So now we have a method that returns all of the books. Now this is where we need to introduce some GraphQL, right? So in my resources folder, I'm going to create a new directory. We're going to call this GraphQL. This is by convention, and we're going to create a schema in here. So we are going to call this schema.graphqls. And if any of this is unfamiliar to you, I will go ahead and leave some links to the other videos that I've done on getting started with GraphQL. This is really just kind of catching us up to where we should be. Today, we really want to focus on some of the mutation stuff that I want to talk about. But again, if you want an intro, there are some videos that walk through all of this. So now we need to create a schema based on our books. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say type book, and this is going to have an ID, title, sure, pages, int, and we need an author, which is going to be a string. We're just going to keep that as a string for now. And then it's going to have a collection of review. And so we'll need a new type for that as well. We'll say new review, ID, title. No, that is not right. But thank you for trying GitHub Copilot. I like it. We do have ID and title, which is good. I'm going to have a comment of type string, and that looks good. So I'm going to create a quick query just so we can make sure that the query is working. So I'm going to say type query is equal to, let's say, find all books, and that's going to return a collection of books. So back in our book controller, let me just rename this to find all books, and let's do a query mapping. And one last step, I'm going to have to go over to Application.properties and enable the graphical UI. So I'm going to say true, and let's go ahead and restart this. And if everything works, we can now head over to the browser and go to the graphical UI. Okay, so with that in place, we can go to documentation. We see there's a single query in here called find all books. So we can say find all books. And we know that a book returns an ID, a title, pages, an author, and reviews. So let's go ahead. Oh, we forgot reviews. Does return a sub-selection. So let's go ahead and say, let's get the ID, the title, and the comment from there. And let's go ahead and select that. And we have our one book. So we have our book, Reactive Spring. We have our review for that book. Everything is looking good. So now we want to get in the business of writing some mutation. So how can we do that? All right, so how can we add some mutations to this controller? So let's go in here and we're going to talk through a few different ways that we could create a new resource, in this case, a book, in our application. So I'm going to create a new method called public, which is going to return a book, and we'll call this create book. And this example is going to take in three simple types. It's going to take in a string for the title. It's going to take in an integer for the pages and a string for the author. So with those three things, we should be able to create a new book. And we can do that by saying book equals new book, and then return the book repository.save. That looks real good. Now we just need to add an annotation here at argument. And again, if you're not familiar with GraphQL, Spring for GraphQL here, we use this annotation to bind a named GraphQL argument onto this method parameter. So with this in place, all we need is our annotation at the method level so that we can connect this method to a method in our schema. So what we're going to say is mutation mapping. And now if we create a method called createBook or a field called createBook on our mutation type, we can link these two up. So let's go back to our schema here, and we're going to say, actually, let's do this up here. And we'll say type equals mutation. And we need to create that createBook. So we're going to say createBook, and this is going to take 3 arguments here. So one called title, which is a string, one called pages, which is an int, and one author, which is of type string, and it is going to return back a book. Okay, so with that in place, we should be able to go ahead and run our application. Let's go back to the graphical user interface here, and I'm just going to call this find all books so I can declare mutation down here, and we'll say mutation create book. And inside of here, we're going to call that create. Oh, you know what I need to do is I need to refresh this or it's not going to take. So we're going to say create book, and then this takes 3 arguments. So again, title, we're going to give it a title, which is my new book. This is number of pages. So pages is going to be 99 in this case, and the author is going to be Dan Vega. So with that, this is also going to return a book. So we need to say what fields we want returned. Let's just go ahead and return them all. We want to see that new ID that's generated. So we'll say ID, title, pages, and author. And if everything works, we should be able to go ahead and run this. And we have a problem. No big deal. Let's check it out. So here we are saying could not resolve parameter 1, which is our string. Did we not? So we have, oh, this is why. So we only added that argument in one place. That's not going to work. So let's save that and rerun this. And if we go ahead and run this again, there's our new book. So we have an ID of 2, my new book, 99, and an author. If we want to run find all books, we'll now see our 2 books in there. And then only this first one has a review on it. So far so good, but we want to take a look at some other options for creating mutations. So what I'm going to do is actually just create a new method here. Let's just call this one, this is also going to return a book. Let's call this add book. And in this case, we are going to have an argument of book input, and we'll call this book. What is a book input, you say? Let's go ahead and check it out. So I'm going to create a new model in here. I'm going to call this, let's see, Java class. We're going to call this a book input, and this is going to be a record. So this is going to take a title, integer of pages, and a string author. So I can never tell with GitHub Copilot which one is there and which one they're suggesting. So we have just this record type. And the reason we're going to use a record type is because on the schema side, this is how you define input in the GraphQL world. So we don't just have a book object that it takes to save. You can create something called an input. So I'm going to say there's an input called book input, and that book input is really just going to take this. So I'm going to copy that and take that. And so now what we can do on the mutation side is say, I want to go ahead and add a book. We'll say that the book is going to be of type book input, and that cannot be null, and this is going to return a book. All right, so far so good. Now we just need to say, we need to have the book repository is going to save a new book, and it's going to use the book input and get the title, the pages, and the author. So with this again, we can say that this is a mutation mapping. Let's go ahead and restart this application. And if everything starts up okay, it does. We can head back over to our playground here, and we can say that I have a mutation called add book. And what we're going to do is, again, we got to refresh Dan. Sorry about that. And we're going to have an add book. Now this time it's going to take one argument. That is going to be book. And that is a book input. So the way that we do that is we just create an object that matches the signature of that input. So I'm going to, again, just kind of take these three fields here and put it inside of this object. And again, this is going to return something. So we can say, let's just return this. But let's just say this and maybe 199 just so we see that it's different. And now we should be able to go ahead and run add book. And boom, we see that that gets created. So just another way. Again, if you have just like one or two fields, this approach will work. But when you get into more complex types and it's not a demo and it's kind of in the real world, right? You'll probably need to move to an input object. So this is the syntax you'll use for that. So those are pretty cool. I want to show you one more approach that we could take here. And to do that, I'm going to create one more method here. I'm going to say that I want to return a list of books. And I'm going to call this batch create. As you can see, GitHub Copilot has helped me out here, so I'll let it finish that for us. So this is going to take in an argument of type list of book inputs. So this can take multiple book inputs, and what it will do, it will turn those into a stream, map those to a new book using the title, the pages, and the author, and then return to us a list. So again, let's say this is a mutation mapping, and then on the input or on the schema side, we just need to define this. So we can say that I want to batch create, and what this is going to take is something called books, and this is where it gets a little funky. So it's going to take a collection of book input that should not be null, and I also don't want the collection to be null. So I want to take in at least one. What this is going to return is a collection of books, right? So pretty cool. Let's go ahead and see if this works. And to save us from watching me typing this, I'm going to paste this one in. But again, we have to refresh. So we have this mutation called batch create. Batch create is going to take in an argument called books, but this is a collection. So we have a collection here, and then we have 5 different books that we're creating using that same book input. So nothing new there, but now we can take 5 of them, and we're going to return the ID, title, pages, and author. So let's see if this works. And there we go. So we've created 5 books here, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and all the properties are returned. So cool. I think that's really what I wanted to show off, just the different ways that in your application you could create some mutations, whether you're taking in simple types here, if you're taking in a more complex type, records in Java 17 and further, or Java 16 and further, but we're using Java 17 here in Spring Boot 3. Records are a great way to create those complex object types. To kind of map up with your schema. So I'm creating a book input here. And then finally, the ability to map that argument to something more complex, like a list of book inputs. So I really hope you found this useful. I'm a big fan of GraphQL. You're going to see more GraphQL content coming from me soon. But hey, friends, if you found some value in this, do me a huge favor. Give me a thumbs up to this, subscribe to the channel, and if you're facing any problems, let me know in the comments below. As always, friends, happy coding.